Welcome back to In with Denoux.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux featuring Jordan Shannon. We're back for episode 2. Jordan, how you doing, man?
It's good to see everybody. Happy to be back. Happy to just chat with my boy. And yeah, I'm excited about tonight's topic, man.
That's what's up. So today we are going to be talking about values and what happened to values, how they've changed over the years. And we're just going to kind of go down that path and talk about really our culture today and how things have changed drastically, whether it has to do with religion, basic respect, things of that nature. So, Jordan, when you think about values today, what do you see that is important today and maybe how it differed from what you believed growing up or things even maybe before we were born, like back in the day, how things were just so different when it comes to values?
Yeah. And I think with values, it's kind of like thinking about things like regionally too, because, we grew up in Florida, right, in the South,
Mm-hmm.
which, people will debate about whether it's the South, but I feel like you get those
Right.
country twang or you get the Southern food, I'm like, it's the South. Let me just tell you
Yeah.
right now. But I think about like aspects of like we talk about like chivalry and all like what does it mean to like be a gentleman
Mm-hmm.
and those types of things. I think those things are still kind of lauded in the South. I haven't lived in Florida in 10 plus years, right? So, but I would imagine aspects of that are still characteristic down there. But it is interesting to see what gets kind of lifted up for us, especially as like young men, as we, continue to grow throughout our life, right? Like, so I feel like a very early thing that gets imprinted on us is like competition, right? And being competitive.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big one that I feel like is like really resonating with me. Like, we, again, Florida sports is a big thing down there, whether it's football, whether it's basketball, whether it's
Right.
parts of baseball, but it's just a lot of big college and pro sports down there. So a lot of us, we just get raised up on playing on the football field or playing on the courts. And
Right.
I mean, what happens within that, man, is like it's good in terms of pushing yourself, but there's always this striving of being the best, being number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's some cool things about that. It's achievement oriented, right? Like that's not a bad thing to do, but I think it becomes a problem when our lives revolve around that, right? And we
Right.
see that within like pro sports, like there was a comedian uh Neil Brennan who did a stand up on Netflix. You should check it out. I can't remember what it's called, but he's famous because he helped co-create Chappelle's Show,
Okay.
and he had a joke about like what was the one documentary we all watched during the pandemic? It's The Last Dance, right?
Yeah.
Like with
Michael
Michael Jordan.
Jordan.
Did that man seem mentally stable to you? And I was like, that's
No.
a very good point. That man was, but it was all about competition. The man was very clear about his value. His value was, I wanted to win. I wanted to be the best. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he proved it. He proved it year in and year out. And aspects of that we can admire, but we can also recognize that there's like aspects of that that's not super like feels like beneficial or maybe not leading to the lives that we really want. I mean, I knew for me early on that I was competitive, and I still can be competitive, but I also feel like I'm very quick to like unless it's something I feel like I'm really good at, like I'm not gonna be super competitive about it.
Right.
I love, you know, I think the biggest thing for me was like running back in high school. So I was
Mm-hmm.
super competitive when it came to track and field. Like you would see me talking smack, you would see me doing it, like, because I felt confident, I felt all of those things. Um, but when I played football, and it would come out sometimes when I played football, but not as much just because I was more so I wasn't as athletically gifted as some of my other family members, like my brother and my dad.
Right.
So I very much leaned away from kind of like the smack talk because I would get humbled
Mm-hmm.
very quickly, or I got humbled very quickly, and those types of things. Um, but I'm going off like I'm just thinking about like that aspect of competition because I feel like that's a big one for young men.
Right.
I think religion obviously is a big one, especially in the South. Like we both are Christian and we're raised
Mm-hmm.
Christian, and a big thing like we don't really talk about. We definitely don't talk about. I think we talk about more now that has changed, but I'll go back 20 years. Unless you went to a church that was like ethnically diverse, like you
Right.
probably didn't talk about like aspects of like nationalism and racism, right? At the
Right.
levels that you probably needed to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I remember that because I remember like I grew up in a Baptist church, and so we were very comfortable having conversations around race because it was predominantly black, and that was
Right.
very much like the lived experience. And I appreciated that. I appreciated aspects of that. But I also recognize that like even within those spaces, like and ultimately, this is not necessarily connected, but it led to me like even just considering what are some of the other things I value within my faith movement.
Right.
Like what I struggled with within that church was like my own doctrinal things, like things that I felt like weren't being necessarily talked about from the Bible. That I was like, if I'm supposed to be a Christian, but we're not really listening to the Bible, then do I really feel like this is going to be the right space for me? So I
Right.
had to do my own wrestling with that and exploring the value of like, what does religion mean to me? And then even as I found the church where I felt like doctrinally, like it aligns with how I view the Bible, I still would struggle with like, I'm still seeing things in that's not really living according to the scriptures, right?
Right.
And so I need to do some more searching and wrestling to where it's like, like I didn't know this was a value that I had 10 or 20 years ago, but now
Right.
I do know it is, and that's something that I can advocate for, speak for. Like I was sharing with you before we got on, right? Like about, I heard a sermon from a friend of ours earlier today. I was listening. It actually popped up on LinkedIn because the
Mm-hmm.
gentleman was talking about getting involved in like nonviolence work. And
Right.
I thought that was interesting too, just because like, you don't really talk about. We don't really. I don't think, at least for me, I haven't heard a message, a sermon, a lecture, or anything about nonviolence in a very long time. You
Mm-hmm.
know, almost I can almost say ever, really. Like
Yeah.
I, yeah, you know what I mean. Like it's just so it's and it was important to kind of listen to that because part of the context of that sermon was the fact of talking about nonviolence in the age of Christian nationalism, and
Yeah.
talking about how like we take so much stock in wanting to have protection, wanting to be prepared to protect self and engage in violence to protect self,
Mm-hmm.
supporting our military, supporting our army. And mind you, those are not bad things, right? Like protecting self, wanting
Right.
to serve in the military, like those aren't inherently bad things. But I think what I was sitting with was just the challenge of like, yeah, no one I have not been to a church where. Well, I'll take that back. I'll take that back. I don't want to say that. I do not hear it talked about enough how much I guess discrepancy or just like how off base it can be when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
like when we hold our Second Amendment rights just as high as our cross. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Like I think that that's something that I feel like we like our Second Amendment rights or like just our view of patriotism and
Mm-hmm.
like to serve our country and to what it means to be a patriot of the United States. I just think is very much steeped in this like identity around like, well, America's the greatest and we need to make sure that we are fulfilling our destiny here, and that people conform to our culture and our identity and assimilate into our culture and our identity and our language. And that obviously doesn't allow for a space of diverse experiences, right? Like in
Sure.
diversity
Sure.
of thought. Um, but I just sit with that. I'm just like, man, like, what would it be like for us to come back to this space of nonviolence, to come
Yeah.
back to like, and I think we see that in the scriptures, right? Through Jesus. Like, Jesus was not someone who engaged in fighting people or self-preservation, right? Like, but it was just this aspect of like, no, like, I'm gonna eat with the people that y'all tell me not to eat with, and I'm gonna spend
Mhm.
time in people's homes, and I'm gonna do this in a way that expends more energy of myself and not seek to protect myself or not seek
Right.
my rights or believe that it's patriotic to serve in this way, but it's just I'm going to do it
Right.
because this is truly the best way to reach people,
Yeah.
through nonviolence, love, through empathy, which I don't think gets talked about. I mean, we can go. It kind of comes back to this aspect of masculinity, like what does it feel
Yeah.
like to be empathetic as a man, right? Like that can
Sure.
almost like have its own stuff that
Yeah.
comes up too, right? It's a
So
value. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
So
I'm gonna
I've
stop you
been a lot.
there. Only because there's so much to unpack with what you said. So
Yeah,
okay. So starting back from the beginning, and we'll work our way through. I think you kind of started talking about competitiveness, right? Like young men competing and how it can become toxic almost. And I think that thought right there. Well, first of all, let me just point it to myself, just so again, we want this podcast to be real, and we don't want to just talk about our strengths and the things we're good at, but the things that we're weak in and the things we had to grow into our character. And so I know for me, the thing probably that I matured in last as a adult man was this unhealthy competitiveness that I had, which I always viewed as a positive thing. And I think there was aspects of it that was positive as a young man, just trying to gain confidence. And I was heavily involved in sports my whole life. And I had little man syndrome, right? Because I'm small. And so
Mm.
I was usually always the smallest one on the court, the smallest one on the field, the smallest one in any athletic regard that I had. And very, very infrequently was there someone smaller than me. But in my mind, I was like 7 feet tall, and I would like get in anybody's face. I would bump anybody, and I grew into that when I was really young. I didn't have that. But as I got a little older and gained confidence and knew that I, had some talent, I kind of grew into this space where I had to be that way to gain respect from other people, especially when it had to do with basketball. And so I had that little man complex where I was, 4'3", but 7 feet tall in my mind. And so I think as I got older though, and I became an adult, I didn't mature my thinking in that way. And so everything was like on 1,000 at all times when it had to do with anything related to competitive natures and sports and things like that. So, but that being said, because you went from there to something way deeper, right? And I think that aspect of men, especially, and I know it's not just men, but specifically in this context, it's mainly men. And I think that it bled into who we are as people outside of just who we were on the field or on the court or whatever. And I think that's why we have all these things of, nationalism and violence and things like that, is it's competitiveness, it's pride. Pride is
Mm-hmm.
probably the biggest thing. And obviously pride is the biggest root cause of so many negative characteristics of men and people. And so I think that the things you talked about early on bled into why you went into this deeper aspect of, talking about nonviolence in church. Why don't we talk about race more in church and all these things, or just in life in general? And so that's very interesting to me, that it went from competitiveness to that, because I do think they flow in the same direction, because I think it does all lean into pride. And
Mm.
and there's good pride to have, but obviously, the world we're living in, pride is a very negative thing. And it's interesting to think about what you brought up in terms of talking about hard topics in church. And it's interesting because I feel like my thinking and my thought process on this has evolved and gone through a lot of different forms. Because when I look at the scriptures and I look at Jesus uh, never shied away from anything, right? But it was interesting to see when he decided to lean into something, when he decided to comfort someone and how he comforted them. And sometimes it was very gentle. Sometimes it was very, you might look at it from the outside looking in. If you don't know Jesus well, it might seem harsh, but it's really just
Hmm.
straightforward in what that person needs. And that's why I think
Yeah.
the scriptures tell us to love as Jesus loved. He doesn't just tell us to love people. He says love as Jesus loved. And sometimes Jesus needed to tell people straight up what was going on in their life. And sometimes they needed
Yeah.
a gentle hand and a gentle word and a hug, from the Lord. And so I think that, my thought process on this used to be like, okay, like you talked about growing up in a Baptist church, and I grew up in a non-denominational church, and it was very diverse. But those things weren't discussed necessarily from the pulpit, even being in a diverse church. And I used to think that maybe not positive is the right word, but I used to think of that as like, okay, we're just leaning into the scriptures. It's not that we're avoiding something or whatever. It's just we're leaning into what the scriptures say, and we're not getting into the culture of the world. Is how I used to look at it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that there's a portion of that that's true. You know, Jesus protected people, but his main goal was to bring people to God, and that was the form of protection he thought they needed the most. But that didn't mean that he ignored physical needs and physical protection of people. And I think that that's a huge lesson and a huge character trait that Jesus had that sometimes we overlook or not ignore, but just don't put enough emphasis on. And so yeah, I think that is interesting what you bring up of, finding this balance of talking about salvation, talking about what we need to change in our lives personally, but then also what are people going through in the world right now, in our community, in our own backyards. What is someone that
Hmm.
doesn't look like me going through, um,
Yeah.
and whatnot. So I think that that's a lot to unpack, and I think that there's a lot we can talk about, but in terms of value, it's interesting because something I was thinking about, and we can jump back into all these things that you just discussed and I just discussed, but I was really thinking about, like, and obviously way back in the day before we were born had all of these issues of their own, right? That we'll discuss, but at the same time, it's interesting because when I think back, even when you watch movies that are like from where they're portraying like the 50s or 60s or whatever, there seems to be this like quiet dignity, right? Like people held themselves a different way, they dressed a different way, they spoke a different way. And again, like I said, there was a whole bunch of other issues back in those times, that are still resonating today. But now, so the way I put it, or the way I was thinking about it, was there was a quiet dignity, and now there's a loud ratchetness. And maybe that's not the most elegant way of putting it. I'll try again. There was a quiet dignity, and now there is like a viral chaos aspect to our world, to
Hmm.
where the things that everybody is watching, the things that gets attention, the things that make money, the things that eyes are drawn to, are these crazy situations where people are just disrespecting themselves, disrespecting other people. I think about
Hmm.
the, Catch Me Outside girl, or all these things that go
Yeah.
viral, right? That people laugh at. And it's
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah.
if that happened in the days of quiet dignity, those people would be outcast. And I'm not saying that is right, right? But at the same time, there was a reason why that was looked down upon long ago,
Yeah.
about modesty and this dignity of yourself, of your family, of the people around you. And again, I'm not saying that, back in those days was perfect, but I do think the way people carried themselves was with more dignity than we see today.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's interesting. So, again, this is a
Yeah.
lot of stuff
Yeah.
to unpack, but I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned quiet dignity, and I was just like, I was just thinking, man, people watching this are gonna think Jordan and Chase are a couple of old heads, just just talking about the way things used to be. But it's so
Facts.
real though. It's so real though, man. Because I'm just thinking about like how you talked about like like a loud disrespect, and I honestly, in a way of like, it's it's like. the dress we mentioned the dress from the 50s, and that feels like it was all of this aspect of this is how we're going to show up and respect ourselves because the world
Hmm.
may not respect us. Like I very
Right.
much can understand why, like even in like churches growing up, like suit and tie on Sunday and things like this, because like we wanted you to hopefully carry that from that church building outside into the community and see yourself worthy of respect in those ways. So I get that. And like on the flip side, right, it's too much of that like constraint or strict adherence to these unclear like expectations around like culture, respect, all of these things, I think has kind of like blew its gap, like where it's just
Hmm.
like everyone's like, nah, man, I want to. It's for me to have self respect is to have freedom, to have autonomy, to just be able to do the things and behave in the way I think, and I think that has its own dangerous endpoint, right? Because if I'm doing things that only I want to do, that's going to benefit me. If I'm behaving in ways and not regarding other people's feelings or not regarding other people's
Right.
ideas, then it's really going to, and it's going to end in a world of isolation, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think about like, I mean, and some folks, obviously like do that stuff. And I do question whether like there are authentic, I guess, like, um, relationships or experiences that can come out of that because when you become a meme or you become like a viral moment,
Right.
it might get you a few dollars. Like I think about what's the girl named the Hawk Tour girl, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, like
Yeah.
I'm she got some good dollars out of that, but did she get like did people really authentically know her? And I don't know if
Hmm.
she wants to be authentically known, but in her mind she got respect. But
Right.
I don't know if that's like the respect that you want or you want to continue perpetuating full out. And I also heard she got into some legal stuff with Bitcoin and
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah.
it feels like it opens up another ways of this. But something else you said that I want to come back to that's connected to this idea of like respect and I think it is a way of just throwing respectability politics out the window. I think people are tired of respectability politics,
Sure.
which and that's from both liberal and conservative sides, right? Like on a liberal space, it's like respectability politics ain't getting people to the freedoms that they deserve or freedoms that they
Sure.
need in terms of social enterprising, in terms of like different programs, different resources that can be given from the government. Like respectability hasn't gotten them there. On the conservative aspect, people just don't want to. People say, "Oh, I can't say the things I want to say without getting punished." And in my
Right.
mind, I'm like, yeah. I mean, it's all this aspect of respectability. If I'm doing like a gross like simplification of it, but also
Sure.
like I think there has to be a level of one. It is pride, like you had mentioned earlier, which is this aspect of us just believing and trusting in ourselves around like we know what's best or we know that this is what we want to do or this
Hmm.
is the way to get ahead in the world and this is how you go along and people are just kind of like bumping against that. It is this hard balance between pride and humility.
Yeah.
Nobody no I wonder if it's like this. Nobody really sees themselves as prideful, but nobody wants to be humble.
Right.
Just cause
Right.
just cause like humility does require some vulnerability on our part, some willingness to ask, some willingness to just say like, hey, like I need help or I don't know how
Hmm.
to go about this or this is how I want to go about it, but I need some guidance onto how to get it. Or this is the respect I'm chasing or the life that I want to chase, but here's how I want to get it. And I
Right.
need some assistance within that. Whereas on the prideful part, we're just kind of feeling like, nah, I got everything. I got it all figured out.
Yeah.
I'm just going to engage the way I want to. I'm going to talk the way I want to. I don't want any restriction. I don't want no old heads telling me about what their lives were like. And it's just
Yeah.
like, wow, like that doesn't seem like a healthy way to live, right? Like
Right.
and being mindful of like all these different complex issues, right? Like, just the ideas around socio-political context and stuff and how that's affected people differently, how trauma affects people differently. So I want to name those
Right.
things. But I also just think we all have to have essence of humility in order to
Yeah.
really go about leaning back into respect. And I think that, and respect is subjective too, right? Like what someone
Sure.
feels respected by, like what you may feel respected by would be different from how I may feel respected by it, right? Like in
Right.
terms, like there are some things we obviously agree on, but it's just like we, like I, this is actually not a good thing, but I'm thinking of myself, like in in some circumstances. I have noticed even in my own job, so I teach full time, and like I work with students who are just getting into graduate school. So they have their bachelor's, but they're thinking
Hmm.
about wanting to do a master's in counseling and things. So I teach them, and the amount of conversations that are being had where they are speaking to me as if they know more about counseling than I do.
Right.
It just is, and yeah, I just sit there and I sit. My reaction is to just kind of play it off and be like, "Oh, that's a very interesting point. Like, yeah, keep it going. Like, you know me, I'm pretty just like go with the flow. I'm like,
Hmm.
I'm just like, oh, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds like a good thing.
Yeah.
And that's not a healthy way to deal with disrespect, right? Like,
Sure.
I think some of the ways I deal with that is just through like processing instances where that becomes even greater. Like if I've experienced like a student not taking my feedback and not listening to me, then it's like, all right, well, we got to actually have some serious conversation or something like that. Or just like maybe even processing that within my own personal therapy or with my partner, like just like all those different things,
Yeah.
right? But I know my initial reaction when I experience disrespect is just shrug it off,
Sure.
and that's not, I'm not saying that's the healthiest way to deal with it, because I think you lose aspects of like advocating for yourself, which is a great value to have. I think you
Right.
lose aspects of just like boldness, just like being like, nah, like you can't be saying stuff like that to your teacher.
Hmm.
Like that don't make no sense. Like why are you talking like this to them? Like
Right.
why are you showing up in booty shorts to class? Like
Yeah.
right. Which I have not had to have that conversation. That would be awkward because I feel like men talking about women's wardrobe
Sure.
to women about these things could just be very, very controversial.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, man. It's crazy because, like, I think the things that we're talking about here, speaking in a Christian perspective. So, those of you that are listening, if you're a Christian, this is for you. If not, take with a grain of salt, but I hope that you do listen to it. But I think that from a Christian perspective, I think we as Christians have lost this sense of, like I was saying earlier, there's a reason. And I think that, man, God is just so wise, so amazing, knows how to phrase things. Jesus knew how to phrase things. And I think there's a reason why he put love as I have loved you in there, because it's something you said is that, there's what respects mean to someone can mean something completely different to someone else, right? But the example that was set from us by Jesus is one way and one way only. And there's no arguing that as a Christian, right?
Mm.
Now, there's things in the scriptures that we can debate about, like nuance and things like that. But the things that Jesus said that were clear are not up for debate, right? And so I think
Yeah,
love
yeah,
as
yeah,
love as Christ has
yeah.
loved you is one of those things where it's not how we want to love. It's not how the world defines love. It's not how I personally define love opposed to what Jordan defines as love. It's love as Christ has loved you. And I know we've
Yeah.
talked about this offline in the last few months, and I didn't think maybe episode 2 we'd bring it up, but I think of the story in John 8, and we had a long conversation about this. And I think that this goes to every situation, every type of person, because I do think that Christians have painted themselves in a bad light in terms of communities that maybe see life differently than Christians do, right? No matter who that may be. And I think that the example that Jesus sets for us in John 8, and I know there's some debate about was this in the original manuscripts of the Bible, but the story is so Jesus, like has his fingerprints all over it in terms of the woman caught in
Yeah.
adultery. And I think that,
Yeah.
and I've told a lot of people this, but I think that is the blueprint of how you treat people, how you respect people,
Mhm.
how you love people. And I think that as Christians, we have failed to follow that model, myself included. But I'm just saying, I just had this realization reading this story a few years ago where I was like, man, this is literally the blueprint of how every Christian should treat a situation in terms of someone that might have different views than us, someone that,
Yeah.
is in the wrong even, right? And if you don't know the story, there's a woman who's caught in adultery. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that in the story, is that she is in the wrong, she is, with someone who is married, but the reaction to her sin is also wrong and sinful in its own right, where the people of the town drag her out and they're ready to stone her, which again, in those days is what was called for of someone caught in adultery. And so they basically are trying to they're using this woman's sin to try to trap Jesus, right? Of what should we do?
Mm-hmm.
Like, should we stone this woman? And Jesus, the steps that he takes is just masterful. And I think something we all need to follow. And I think that even if you're not a Christian, there's this process that anyone can respect, to where this woman, who again is in the wrong, but the reaction to her wrong is also incorrect. And so Jesus basically, starts writing in the sand. We don't know exactly what he was writing, but he starts asking the people, who is without sin. And so basically the steps that I see he takes is he protects this woman physically, right? She is in physical danger of potentially dying due to stoning. And so he protects this woman by kind of turning it on the crowd and making it about everyone instead of singularly about this woman, everyone against this woman. So he kind of turns it and he makes it about everyone. Who hasn't done something wrong? Who hasn't sinned? Who hasn't fallen short? And there's these penalties for sin that maybe we should take the brunt of, but that we haven't. And, there's a lot of speculation of what he wrote in the sand. Did he write out all the sins? And the people are like, oh, yeah, I've done that. Oh, yeah, I've done that. Because it says the older went away first and then the younger went away. So it was like, is it because they had more sin because they were older? So like as he wrote the sins, they were like, okay, I've done that. And they walk away. I won't judge her anymore. Right? So Jesus protects the woman physically. Then he makes it about everyone. He brings everyone into the situation and shows us that none of us are right. We're all wrong in some form or fashion. Just because this woman's sin is very public and very obvious, it doesn't mean that our sin is any less wrong just because it's internal or smaller culturally or whatever. So he protects the woman. He makes it about everyone. Then as everyone goes away, it's just him and the woman, right? And I think this is the part that the world expects of Christians, and Christians back down. And I don't think we should back down. And that's the last 10%, right? Because people are always saying to Christians that are rightfully so, that are judging, they're like, why don't you love like Jesus? Why don't you love like Jesus? And I think that's true. Like, I think we judge too often as a Christian community, people that are not like us or don't have the same beliefs as us. But at the same time, when everyone's gone, it's not in front of everyone. It's not humiliation. When it's just Jesus and this woman, he says, leave your life of sin, And he asks her, he's like, has no one judged you? And then she says, no one. And he's like, then neither do I judge you. Go leave your life of sin. And I think as Christians, we've fallen back. A lot of us have fallen back from still challenging. If someone does want to be right with God and be a Christian, it's like, look, you got to leave your life of sin. But at the same time, if they don't, then it's not a judgment. It's not our place to make a judgment. And so I think that blueprint that Jesus lays before us with that woman is how we need to go into every situation. And I think that falls into the respect stuff that we're talking about, and I think that also falls into love as Christ has loved you, right? He could have just let that woman walk away and think, I'll keep living how I was living, and these people were wrong for bringing it to everyone's attention. But he still lets her know, you're in the wrong too in terms of the law of God. So if you want to be right with God, leave your life of sin. And I think that is beautiful, man. Like, I think that is something that we need to model our life after, model interactions with people, especially, the obvious, thing that you can look at is like the Christian community and the LGBTQ plus community. That's like the obvious one. And I think the Christian community has done a horrible job overall, not everyone, of how to interact, how to teach, how to listen, how to protect. I think that what you're talking about with nationalism in the US, I think that has bled into Christianity in America too. I think a lot of
Absolutely. Absolutely.
nationalism of the country, for whatever reason, has bled into Christianity in the United States, which is kind of a weird dynamic. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up that story because I just think it is the perfect model. And even if you're not a Christian, if you think like just take the Bible, take Jesus out of that situation, it's like protect someone,
Hmm.
make it about everyone else, so it's not like everyone against this woman who's like, has no protection. He makes it about everyone, kind of brings everyone into this on the same level. No one is above anyone else, no matter what they have done or haven't done. And then alone, without the public humiliation aspect there anymore, everyone has left. Just him and the other person, one on one, face to face. If you want to say, man to woman, um,
Hmm.
tells her what he thinks is wrong and that you need to change. And I think that is boldness. I think that we've lost that. Like everything I said about, Christians not handling things the right way, that's true. But at the same
Yeah.
time, if you are a Christian and you're living correctly, if you're trying to do what Jesus did, you also need to have the boldness to where if someone wants to live life with Christ, you got to tell them, leave your life of sin. I need that. We all need refinement.
Hmm.
There's times where I'm really doing really well. There's times where I'm not doing really well. And so, I mean, I'm working on myself right now, right? Like figuring out, you know, why am I, where I'm at right now, and
Yeah.
what part have I played in it, and what do I need to change, and what boldness do I need to call out from other people too, just because you're in a bad place and you're trying to get back to where you were. And I don't necessarily think I'm like in the worst place I've ever been in my life or anything like that, but I still need to have the boldness to when I see something to call it out, but in a way where it protects, in a way where it does not humiliate, but in a way where it's bold and it's straightforward and love. And so I think that's what I think of when I think of love Christ as Christ has loved you. And I think that bleeds into the respect aspect that we're talking about.
Yeah. I think, and I love that story. First off, Chase taking us to church. I hope y'all taking notes. But I want to also just say, like, I love that story because Jesus is also challenging them in their Jewish law at the time. At
Right.
the law, the Jews that brought that woman before Jesus, they were right in their law that they were supposed to stone her.
Right.
Like they would, so in their minds, they were like, Jesus, you better side. They were almost like trying to like force Jesus to say, hey, you better agree with us, kind of thing.
Right.
But Jesus is more of like saying, no, I'm going to challenge you and protect this woman more so. And this is how I'm going to protect her is because I'm going to invite you all to look at yourself and do some introspection. And that's such a great example of nonviolence. I think it's also an example of encouraging humility. Something I'm witnessing a lot, and I have to be careful myself, like when I'm on Twitter, just because like Twitter is the Wild West when it comes to just navigating conversation. You can't really have a serious conversation on Twitter. You can't really do it on
Right.
social media, but definitely not Twitter. And everybody wants that moment of shaming someone or owning someone or saying that. And I've been guilty of wanting that myself.
Right.
Just like when I'm engaged in a heated argument about this issue or this political issue, or even it doesn't even have to be political stuff. I argue with Gator fans on stuff, and I'm just like, y'all are idiots.
Yeah.
What y'all talking about? Kind of, and it's interesting because like we're not so quick to just say, you know what, no, I'm wrong, or you know what,
Right.
no, I'm making a mistake. We are very quick to assume that we are right, and I do wish that we would kind of go back to this place of like having that learner's heart, of having
Mm.
that humble heart, um, and and again, I think humility, respect. I think these are all values that we should be aspiring towards. But I also think it does come to play. Like this is why our us listening to Jesus is so important too, right? Because when we hear the message of humility and respect, or humility and pride and all these things, it is important about like who's saying it and who are they
Sure.
saying it to, right?
Yeah.
I and and the message, unfortunately, right, can still be the same, but it's like if it's constantly being repeated to a certain demographic about their how they're showing up and their tone or anything, right? Like that can be heard some kind of way, right? Like if it's
Sure.
said from a different person. And I'm getting off, like that's probably another subject for another day, but it just got me thinking about, like, man, like, it's on incumbent upon us to have that humility of saying, like, you know what, no, maybe I'm in the wrong here, to just listen and learn, or what can I learn from this person in this moment. I don't think you can learn a lot from someone who engages in hate. So
Right.
let me
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
say that as a caveat.
Absolutely.
like like in this scenario with Jesus' story, right? Like, it was clear that the people that brought that woman before him, they didn't really have regard for that woman, right?
Right.
They were more so about wanting to own Jesus and say, like, hey, prove us right, and prove our law right and our customs right. And Jesus is like, why would I do that? Like,
Yeah.
why should I let you think that you're okay and you're in the right? And I love, again, that he challenged that law aspect,
Hmm.
right, through a means of nonviolence. Like, again, this kind of comes back to that big thing around, like, our belief around the Second Amendment and
Right.
self-preservation and nationalism. It's like, do we really fundamentally believe that America's a Christian nation and that it's our job to make sure that we spread it through force and through empire?
Right.
Well, I don't know what Bible you're reading, but if we're reading the same scriptures, I think we would see that that's not how the message was actually being spread, right? It was
Right.
literally people going house to house, door to door, spending the night at people's homes, like sharing
Hmm.
meals, serving one another. Like, it was just this aspect of love, and I do think I think that that's just a lesson on the human connection, right? Even if you're not spreading the gospel, I feel like that's a great way to build community. It's a
Sure.
great way to build community with your neighbors, is to just go over and make something for them, or to invite them into your
Hmm.
home, or to spend some time engaging in the things that they are passionate about, or hobbies that they're interested in, right? Like, or just letting them know who you are, and getting and them being able to ask you questions about your life, right? I definitely feel like we have leaned away from that, and part of that is the pandemic. Other aspects of that is just, I wonder if that's just how we've become with technology, is just more disengaged interpersonally, like face to
Sure.
face, and just more like, all right, through kind of like what we talked about in the last episode around, like,
Right.
we're so used to texting that we just forgot how to be human with one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and as I say that, it sounds sad, but it's also just like, that's the reality, right? Like, the
Yeah.
reality is, like, we are at this place where nobody, I won't say nobody, because that's projecting. I will say I have not done a good job of, like, really, like, we've been living in this place for about a year now, and I know it's been on my wife's heart to want to, invite some neighbors over, and I
Hmm.
know we have not done a great job of taking initiative of that. Now, I want to offer some grace to myself. We have a
Sure.
2-year-old, and we watch him at
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
and he is freshly two, and we do not have childcare. So let me just say
Yeah.
that within that, and I'm pretty sure, like, you and other folks will give me grace, but it's also like, that's an area I can grow in. Is like, hey, let me go over to my neighbor's house and, like, make them something, or invite them
Sure.
over for dinner, or, like, right, you know what I mean? Like see each other, as opposed to kind of like expect assuming that people are going to just judge us,
Right.
even though they might. They may judge you. Like,
Sure.
like, that's the
Sure.
reality. The reality is, people may judge you, but that can't stop you from connecting with people and also being willing to look at yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's really interesting that, thinking about, how you have brought it to this, like, violence, and, thinking about how we think about our Second Amendment right and all these things. It's so interesting just looking back at that story too, is that this is a violent crowd, right? Like, they want to stone this woman to death. Like, that's what they are
Yeah,
pushing for.
yeah,
And yet Jesus, before he even says anything, he's like, writing in the sand. He, you know, in no way he takes the violence and just kills it like
Yeah.
immediately. It's crazy. And I know that that's Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Like none of us speak like Jesus. None of us have the full character that Jesus had.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's lessons that can be learned. And I think as a community, I think that's why community is so heavily preached in the scriptures, is that as a community, we reflect the character of Jesus, right? You have characters of Jesus that I don't have. I have characters of Jesus you
Mhm.
don't have.
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't say don't have, but like I might have strengths that you don't have
No,
and
yeah,
you have strengths I don't
yeah,
have.
I would agree with that.
And so together we can project the things that Jesus did as one man. And so I think that that's why it's so important to get on the same page of we don't need violence to change the world, you know? And I think that sure there's times to protect yourself physically, protect your family
Mhm.
if they're in danger and things of that nature, but that's not really the things we're talking about. And I think Jesus
Yeah.
challenging the law of the time is huge. Like he puts this woman's protection and safety ahead of the laws of the day, you know? And I think that that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're talking about in terms of everyone keeps pointing to the laws of the day. And to be clear, like, I don't know 100% what I feel about the Second Amendment. And I go back and forth on, I honestly think the only thing that really makes me even think about it, because I've never shot a gun. I've never owned a gun outside of a paintball gun. But when I do think about like if I had a family, if I had a child, like if I'm in the position that you're in right
Mhm.
now, like would my mind change, you know, if someone comes into
Oh
my
yeah.
home or someone threatens
Yeah.
my family? And so that's the only thing that kind of like, you know, but that's not really what we're talking about, right? We're just talking about individually and these things that we're learning, especially from the
Yeah.
story of Jesus and how he was able to calm a violent crowd and let everyone know, look, we're all the same, basically, is what he's saying, right? We're all the same. We all fall short. We all have flaws. You know, we all mess up. Would I want to be in this woman's position if I had messed up, you know? And I think that that's so huge. You know, I think that that
Mhm.
is something that we don't think about now, especially in America, is looking at Jesus's character over the laws of the land, right? And I think that that's such a huge aspect of what we're talking about. And so, yeah, man, I think that we could go on and on about this, and I'm actually thinking, why don't we stop and do a part two of this? Because I think there's so much we haven't got into. We're at about 45 minutes or so, and so
I feel you.
let's go ahead and close out, and then we'll do a part two of this because I think that this conversation is so important. So everyone joining us, thank you so much for joining us again. Please like, follow, subscribe, share with your friends. We are so grateful that you're joining us on this journey, and we'll be back for part two next week. Thanks for joining in with Denoux featuring Jordan Shannon.